Alex Turner had always been good at blending in. It was a skill he had honed over the years, perfecting the art of looking like everyone else while hiding something far darker beneath the surface. To the outside world, he was just another accountant, a quiet, hard-working man who rarely attracted attention. His colleagues at the firm knew him as someone who kept his head down, never causing trouble, always meticulous in his work as the perfect cover. But beneath the facade of normalcy, Alex led a double life. By day, he dealt with numbers, spreadsheets, and tax returns. But by night, he was managing one of the most sophisticated money laundering operations in the city. It wasn't something he'd set out to do, but once he found the cracks in the system, the opportunities to exploit, it was hard to walk away. The plan was simple, at least on paper. Alex used his position at a mid-level accounting firm to funnel dirty money through seemingly legitimate businesses. He set up shell companies, fake charities, and a complex web of offshore bank accounts. Each layer of the operation was designed to obscure the origin of the funds, making it nearly impossible to trace. He would receive deposits, often from unknown sources, into accounts that seemed completely unrelated to his business dealings. From there, the money would be funneled through a maze of transactions, always ensuring it passed through several intermediary accounts before reaching its final destination, the pockets of those who needed to launder the money. It wasn't just about making money for Alex, it was about the challenge. He wasn't a reckless criminal, he was a perfectionist. He spent hours each day refining his methods, staying one step ahead of any potential investigation. His knowledge of the financial system gave him an edge over others in the game. He could spot weaknesses and loopholes where others saw only complexity. The system was vast, and the rules were intricate, but Alex knew exactly how to play the game. And for years it worked. No one suspected him. The money flowed and the accounts grew fatter. He even started expanding, bringing in more partners, people who could help him launder larger sums. With each new connection, Alex built a stronger and more resilient operation. He felt untouchable, convinced that nothing could bring his empire crashing down. The only rule he lived by was one of discretion. Never draw attention to yourself, never get greedy, and never let anyone get too close. He trusted no one completely, knowing that the more people involved, the higher the risk of a slip-up. But as the operation grew, so did the pressure. The constant vigilance, the fear of getting caught, it began to gnaw at him. Every time his phone rang, every time someone knocked at his door, a part of him wondered if this would be the moment someone would finally catch on. He lived in a state of quiet paranoia, always second-guessing every transaction, every phone call. Even so, Alex believed that as long as he remained careful, as long as he kept his work behind closed doors, he could continue to pull the strings from the shadows. The life he had built was secure, he thought, until he began receiving strange messages. They were short at first, cryptic in nature, almost as if someone knew just enough to keep him on edge. It was a sign that his perfect cover, the one he had worked so hard to create, was starting to fray at the edges. The unsettling feeling that had been growing in him was now becoming a reality. At first, Alex thought the message was a fluke, a random text sent by someone who didn't know what they were talking about. But when the messages started coming more frequently and the details began to sound too accurate to ignore, a wave of dread washed over him. The first message had simply said, "I know what you're doing." It wasn't signed and it wasn't threatening at first, but Alex couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had sent it knew more than they should. He brushed it off initially, telling himself it was probably some scam or a prank. He had a reputation for being a quiet, ordinary accountant, and no one should be paying attention to him. But over the next week, the messages kept coming. Each one contained a small detail that only someone who was closely involved in his operation would know. A particular account number, a partner's name, a shell company he'd set up months ago. The messages were becoming more specific, each one a little more unsettling than the last. At first, Alex tried to ignore them. He deleted the texts immediately, but the unease lingered. Then the messages began to take a more sinister turn. "I know where you hide your files. I can see the transactions you've made." There was a sense of intimacy in these messages, as if the sender had been watching him for much longer than he had realized. The look Sophie gave him said those words to them. She had given him her private files, to his accounts, to the very heart of his operation, was impossible to ignore. But the fact that someone had been tracking him, someone with access to his private files, to his accounts, to the very heart of his operation, was impossible to ignore. As soon as the operation came to a halt, was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the secrecy of the operation that made Alex nervous. It was the fact that someone had been so close without him ever realizing it. As the messages grew more intense, Alex's paranoia deepened. He had always prided himself on being meticulous, covering his tracks in ways that made it almost impossible for anyone to trace the money back to him. But now, for the first time, doubt began to creep into his mind. What if his carefulness wasn't enough? What if there was a flaw he hadn't seen, a gap in the web that was allowing someone to peer into his world? His mind raced. Could it be one of his partners? No, he thought. He had always been careful about who he worked with. He had built a system that didn't allow anyone to know too much, to have too much power. There were multiple layers between him and his partners, each one designed to ensure that no one could expose him, yet someone was getting through, and that realization was terrifying. He began to wonder whether one of his own associates had turned on him, selling him out for a higher price. The messages began to take a darker turn, now warning him that his time was running out. "It's only a matter of time. You can't hide forever." The subtle threat became more apparent with each passing day, and soon Alex was consumed by the fear that he was being watched, followed. He double-checked the locks on his doors, felt eyes on him as he walked through the streets, and scanned every room for hidden cameras. The life he had built, the empire of secrecy and deceit, was suddenly under siege by an unseen force, and the walls of his perfect world were closing in on him. This threat was real. Whoever was behind the messages had the power to destroy everything Alex had worked so hard to create. As Alex looked over his shoulder with growing paranoia, he realized that he could no longer trust anyone, not even the people he had relied on for years. As the pressure mounted, Alex found himself seeking refuge in his most trusted partner, Mark. Mark had been with him for years, a loyal ally who had helped him build the complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts that kept his money laundering empire running smoothly. But now Alex's desperation led him to believe that Mark was his last hope. He needed reassurance, confirmation that someone still had his back. It was a gamble, but it seemed like the only option. The meeting took place in a small, dimly lit cafe on the outskirts of the city, a place where they could talk without drawing too much attention. Alex hadn't wanted to meet in person at first, but the constant stream of threatening messages had left him with no other choice. As soon as he sat down, he leaned forward, his eyes scanning the room, his nerves frayed. Mark arrived shortly after, his face unreadable, the usual warmth missing from his expression. Finally, he took a breath and let out a sigh of relief. "Mario, I've been getting messages," Alex said, trying to sound calm, though his voice betrayed the fear he was trying to hide. Someone knows what we're doing. They're onto us, Mark. I don't know how, but they're getting closer. I need your help. I need to know if you've heard anything, if you've been contacted too." Mark didn't immediately respond. He sat back in his chair, his gaze lingering on Alex, as if weighing the situation. For a long moment, Alex wondered if Mark was going to deny it, brush it off as a coincidence, or even worse, act like everything was fine. But when Mark finally spoke, the words sent a chill through Alex's spine. "I've been contacted too," Mark said, his voice low. "But not by who you think." Alex's heart skipped a beat. He had expected this kind of revelation, but the unease that settled over him was palpable. "Oh, then?" he asked, though he feared the answer. Mark hesitated for a moment longer, and Alex could see the strain in his eyes. "There's someone else," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone with more power, more influence than either of us. They've been watching everything we've done, every transaction, every account, and they know about you, Alex. They know everything." A cold sweat formed on Alex's brow. The walls of his world were collapsing faster than he could keep up. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice shaking. Mark leaned in closer, lowering his voice even further. "I don't know," he admitted, "but they offered me a way out, a chance to walk away from this clean, no questions asked. They said they could protect me. They promised I wouldn't have to face the consequences." Alex's mind raced. It wasn't like Mark to be tempted by such offers. He had always been the practical one, the one who understood the stakes and played the game carefully. But Alex also knew that everyone had their breaking point. Mark had always been a little more restless than he let on, a little more willing to take risks. Now it seemed that the weight of their operation was finally taking its toll. "What are you saying?" Alex asked, the words thick with a mix of anger and disbelief. Mark's eyes darted around the cafe, checking for anyone who might be listening. "I'm saying I've been offered a deal," he replied, his voice quieter now. "They want me to turn you in. If I give them everything, every detail, every account number, they'll let me go. They'll make sure I stay out of this. It's a chance at a fresh start, Alex. A way out." The shock hit Alex like a physical blow. The betrayal wasn't just in the offer, it was in Mark's hesitation, his willingness to entertain the idea. Alex's mind raced, trying to process the implications of what Mark was saying. He had trusted him with everything. How could Mark even consider betraying him like this? But the reality was clear. Mark was playing both sides. While he continued to help Alex manage the operation, he was also feeding information to the people who threatened their empire. It was a double game, and Alex was losing. Exercise. Exercise 1. Land. He leaned back in his chair, trying to gather his thoughts. Mark's gaze never left him, but there was something different in his eyes now, something that hinted at a decision already made. Alex knew he couldn't trust him the way he had before. The walls were closing in, and now his closest ally was looking out for himself. "You'll regret this," Alex said finally, his voice cold, though the anger bubbling inside him threatened to spill over. "You don't understand what you're getting yourself into." "But—" Mark didn't reply. He just sat there, eyes downcast, as if he had already made his peace with whatever was coming next. As Alex left the cafe, the weight of betrayal settled on his shoulders. He couldn't trust Mark anymore, but there was no time to waste on anger. There was a more pressing threat. Someone knew everything. And now Alex had to figure out how to outmaneuver not only the authorities, but the people closest to him. As the days passed, Alex could feel the weight of his empire beginning to crumble. The once perfect system he had built, one he had spent years carefully constructing, was starting to unravel in ways he couldn't control. It wasn't just the ominous messages anymore. It was everything. His associates pulling away, his financial transactions being flagged, and the constant sense that someone was just waiting for him to slip up. The first sign of trouble came when one of his shell companies, a seemingly minor entity he had set up in the Bahamas, suddenly faced a bank audit. It was routine at first, but then the auditors started asking questions that didn't make sense. They were too specific, too pointed. Someone had tipped them off, and Alex knew that it wasn't just a coincidence. The authorities were beginning to close in, piece by piece, and they were using the cracks he had never noticed to find their way in. As Alex scrambled to protect his operations, he couldn't ignore the growing sense of panic. He had always been careful, meticulous about hiding his tracks, but now it felt as though the walls were caving in. Every move he made seemed to have an echo, a ripple that caused something else to shift, something he couldn't control. The more he tried to distance himself from the operation, the more it seemed to come back to him. He tried to hide money, pull funds from one account to another, but there were too many holes, too many exposed edges. The cracks in the system were too wide to repair, and it was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots. The pressure was building with each passing day. He couldn't trust anyone anymore. Mark, once his most trusted ally, had turned on him, leaking vital information to the authorities. The betrayal cut deeper than he cared to admit. At first, Alex had thought Mark was just trying to cover his own back, but as time went on, it became clear that Mark had been playing both sides from the beginning. The constant messages, the deals he had made with whoever was threatening them, it all made sense now. Mark had sold him out. Not out of fear, but out of greed. And the worst part was that Alex couldn't stop him. The next blow came when one of the financial institutions that had been processing his transactions froze one of his larger accounts. At first, Alex thought it was a mistake, perhaps some sort of error in the system. But when he made the call to inquire, he was greeted with questions he couldn't answer. The account was being flagged for suspicious activity, and the representative hinted that an investigation was underway. Alex's stomach dropped. He had anticipated some level of scrutiny, but not this. Not this soon. He tried to access other accounts, to move money around, but it was too late. The entire web was beginning to collapse. The people he had thought were loyal to him were being questioned. The institutions that once turned a blind eye to his activities were now scrutinizing every transaction. Alex's carefully constructed empire, built over years of deceit and manipulation, was now exposed to the light. Desperation set in. There was no longer any room for caution or calculation. Alex knew that the authorities were closing in on him, and there was nowhere to run. The constant fear that had been gnawing at him for weeks was now a crushing reality. It wasn't just the law he had to worry about. It was the anonymous figure who had been watching him all along. The one who had known about his operation before anyone else. The one who had played the long game, waiting for Alex to slip. As the days passed and the investigation deepened, Alex realized that there was no way out. The people he had trusted, the empire he had built, and the careful balance of power he had so expertly crafted were all falling apart, piece by piece. His own paranoia had blinded him to the fact that it wasn't just the authorities he had to worry about. It was the betrayal from within, the people closest to him who had been working against him all along. And now, with every passing moment, it seemed like the walls were closing in tighter, with no way to escape. Alex had always believed he could control everything, the money, the deals, the people. But now, as the authorities closed in and the last of his empire crumbled around him, he realized just how wrong he had been. The final betrayal hit him like a knife to the gut, sharp and sudden, a twist he had never seen coming. When the doorbell rang that morning, Alex had a sinking feeling in his stomach. He had been expecting it, perhaps even dreading it, but he wasn't ready for what followed. As he opened the door, two uniformed officers stood on his doorstep, their eyes cold and impersonal. Before he could react, they informed him that he was under arrest for money laundering, fraud, and conspiracy to commit several financial crimes. The world he had so carefully built was falling apart in that instant. They had found everything, and it was clear they had no intention of letting him slip away. But what truly shook him was the person who stood behind them, his brother Adam. For years, Alex had trusted Adam more than anyone, convinced that no one would ever betray him in the way others might. Adam had always been the quieter one, the one who stayed in the background, and Alex had assumed that loyalty ran deeper than anything else. But now, seeing his brother standing there, silent and cold, Alex felt a wave of shock and disbelief wash over him. Adam had never been part of the operation, at least not directly. He had always kept a low profile, never involved in the day-to-day management of the businesses or the financial dealings. He was the kind of person who never attracted attention. But now, with Alex's arrest imminent, Adam's role in the unraveling was clear. He wasn't just a bystander. He was the mastermind behind the collapse, the man who had been watching from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Alex couldn't understand it. He thought back to the countless hours they had spent together. Family dinners, quiet nights, everything seemed so normal. How could Adam have been involved in bringing him down? But the truth hit him like a ton of bricks. Adam had been feeding information to the authorities all along. While Alex had been focused on his empire and his network, his brother had quietly been selling him out. Adam's betrayal was far deeper than Alex could have imagined. He had known everything about the accounts, the shell companies, the hidden transactions, and had kept it all to himself until the moment was right. All those late nights when Alex thought he was hiding his tracks, Adam had been watching, taking notes. And when the pressure had finally become too much for him to handle, Adam had made his move, cutting a deal with the authorities for full immunity in exchange for his cooperation. Letting a fly, the arrest came quickly. As the officers led Alex out of his house, he could barely process what was happening. He looked at Adam one last time, but his brother didn't look back. There was no guilt, no sorrow, just a cold detachment that sent a chill down Alex's spine. It was clear that Adam had made his decision long ago, and Alex was nothing more than collateral damage in his quest for freedom. Since Bernie was dead, Alex was nothing more than collateral damage in his quest for freedom. The betrayal was final, and there was no coming back from it. As Alex was driven away in the back of a police car, his mind raced, not just with fear of the impending trial, but with the crushing realization that the one person he had trusted most had been the one to bring him down. The man who had always been by his side was now the very reason his empire had fallen, and the weight of that betrayal would haunt Alex for the rest of his life. In the aftermath of Alex's arrest, everything he had worked for crumbled into nothingness. The empire he had spent years constructing, carefully navigating the labyrinth of financial systems to launder millions of dollars, was now exposed for the world to see. The scandal was everywhere, the press calling him a criminal mastermind, the face of corporate corruption. His name was no longer a symbol of success, but of deceit and betrayal. As the news spread, his clients turned their backs on him, his associates distanced themselves, and the vast network he had built began to disintegrate. But nothing stung more than the realization that the one person who could have stopped it all, his own brother Adam, was the reason for it all. Adam, the quiet brother who had always kept to the background, had negotiated a deal with the authorities. He had quietly slipped into the role of the informant, feeding them every detail of Alex's operation. When the investigation began to tighten its grip, Adam had been ready to hand over everything, and he had. While Alex's world came crashing down, Adam was nowhere to be found in the headlines. His deal with the authorities meant that his name never made it to the press. He had walked away clean, while Alex was left to face the consequences. Meanwhile, the pain of that betrayal went beyond the criminal charges and the ruined reputation. It cut deeper than anything Alex had experienced in his life. He had trusted Adam more than anyone, had treated him like a partner in everything, and yet it had been his brother who had orchestrated his downfall. For Alex, the hardest part wasn't losing the money or even the respect he had once commanded. It was the realization that he had been blind to the person closest to him. In prison, Alex's days became a blur of anger, regret, and disbelief. He was surrounded by other men who had fallen from grace, criminals with stories of their own. But nothing seemed to matter. They were strangers to him, and yet they too had been betrayed by the very systems they had once believed in. But for Alex, there was no camaraderie and shared suffering. His mind constantly raced, obsessing over the betrayal, the twisted sense of loyalty that had led Adam to do what he did. He couldn't escape it, the feeling that he had been completely blindsided. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Adam's face, the brother who had promised loyalty and trust. Now just another person who had turned their back on him for the sake of self-preservation. His days in prison were marked by isolation. He had no one left to turn to. The partners who had once helped him launder money had either disappeared into the shadows or had been arrested themselves. The people he had trusted to help him cover his tracks were now either testifying against him or cutting ties entirely. The fear of facing the consequences of his actions hung over him, but it was the emotional toll that was worse than anything. He had spent years building something that seemed invincible, and it had all crumbled because he had trusted the wrong person. As the trial approached, the full extent of Alex's crimes would be laid bare for the public. The charges against him were severe, and the penalties were even more daunting. The best he could hope for was a reduced sentence, but even that seemed unlikely. In his solitary cell, Alex had plenty of time to think, to replay every moment of his rise and fall, to examine where things had gone wrong, and in the quiet, painful reflection, he realized that his biggest mistake wasn't in the money laundering. It was in placing his trust in someone who had never shared his values, someone who had always harbored a quiet ambition of his own. By the time Alex was finally sentenced, there was little left of the man he had once been. The money, the power, the network. It was all gone. And though he would spend years behind bars, the greatest punishment was the unshakable knowledge that his brother's betrayal was the thing he could never escape.